Miss Marple and the Conundrum beneath the Christmas tree. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ali. Are you counting the days to the winter holidays, New Year and Christmas? Or do you prefer the easy warmth of summertime? Tell us below, and don't forget to subscribe so our cozy community can keep growing. Now, let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. The Vicarage Decorating Party. The afternoon light had that peculiar quality of December in an English village, thin and silvery. Filtering through the tall windows of St. Mary Mead Vicarage with a hesitant grace, Miss Jane Marple stood near the fireplace, her knitting needles clicking with their familiar rhythm as she observed the bustling activity around her. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Leonard Lane, was directing operations with the sort of cheerful determination that reminded Miss Marple rather unpleasantly of her cousin. Fanny's ill-fated attempt to organize the Women's Institute Bazaar of 1932. Just a little higher. Mr. Hale, if you please, Mrs. Lane called out, her plump face flushed with exertion and excitement. The angel must be perfectly straight, or it simply won't do. Mr. Gregory Hale, the choirmaster, balanced somewhat precariously on a stepladder, his thin frame tensed with concentration as he adjusted the tree-topper. He was a man of perhaps 45, with receding dark hair and the sort of precise, careful movements that spoke of a life lived according to rigid schedules. Miss Marple noticed that his hands, though steady now, bore the faint tremor of someone who had perhaps been more nervous earlier in the day. "Quite so, Mrs. Lane," he replied in his measured voice. "One must always strive for perfection in matters concerning the church." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. There was something in his tone, slight edge, that suggested Mr. Hale's perfectionism extended well beyond the placement of Christmas angels. She had known men like that before her late uncle, for instance, who had kept such meticulous accounts of every farthing spent that he had quite forgotten to live. "Miss Marple, would you be so kind as to help me with these ornaments?" Mrs. Lane approached with a large cardboard box, slightly dusty from storage. "I'm afraid they've been rather jumbled together, and you have such a way of sorting things out." "Of course, dear," Miss Marple replied, setting aside her knitting dot as she began to unwrap the delicate glass baubles from their tissue paper. She was aware of the various conversations flowing around the room like streams joining a river. The Reverend Leonard Lane himself stood by the refreshment table, engaged in earnest discussion with Dr. Haydock about the upcoming charity appeal. The vicar was a kindly man with thinning grey hair and spectacles that perpetually slipped down his nose. His gentle manner concealed, Miss Marple suspected, a sharper intelligence than most gave him credit for. Near the tree, 3 children from the village were arranging wrapped parcels for the Christmas raffle. Little Peggy Winthrop, aged 7, took her task with utmost seriousness, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated on placing each package just so. Her older brother Tom was less careful, dropping parcels with careless enthusiasm that made his mother, Mrs. Winthrop, call out gentle reprimands from across the room. "Do be careful, Tom. Some of those might be fragile." Mrs. Winthrop was a widow who ran the village post office, a position that afforded her considerable knowledge of local affairs. She had that alert, watchful quality that postmistresses often developed, though whether this came from natural curiosity or professional necessity, Miss Marple could not quite determine. The third child, young Robert Finch, grandson of the elderly toy maker, worked with quiet efficiency. He was a solemn boy of 9, old beyond his years, since his parents had died in an influenza outbreak 2 years prior. His grandfather, Mr. Oswald Finch, sat by the window in an armchair, watching the proceedings with roomy but observant eyes. "Lovely to see the young ones taking part," Miss Marple remarked to Mrs. Lane as she hung a particularly fine silver ornament on a lower branch. "It reminds one that Christmas is really their season, isn't it?" "Indeed," Mrs. Lane agreed warmly, "though I must confess, I do enjoy it myself. There's something about the decorating that brings back one's childhood." Miss Marple smiled, but her eyes had strayed to Mr. Hale, who had descended from the ladder and was now straightening the parcels beneath the tree with rather more vigor than seemed necessary. He picked up one package, frowned at it, then set it down in a different position entirely. "Mr. Hale takes great care with everything," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Oh yes," Mrs. Lane said, lowering her voice slightly. "He's been absolutely invaluable to the church since he took over the choir 2 years ago. Of course, it was a difficult time for him, inheriting his uncle's estate under such tragic circumstances." Miss Marple's fingers continued their work with the ornaments, but her attention sharpened. His Uncle Arthur Whitcomb. Terrible business. Drowned in the village pond during a winter storm. Oh, must be 10 years ago now. They never found the body, you know. The pond is deeper than it looks, with all that mud at the bottom. Mrs. Lane shuddered delicately. "Mr. Hale was quite devoted to him, I understand." "How very sad," Miss Marple murmured. She glanced again at the choirmaster, who was now speaking with Dr. Haydock, his voice too low to be overheard, but his posture was rigid, defensive almost, and twice he glanced toward the window as if expecting to see something unwelcome. The door to the vicarage opened with a gust of cold air, and a young woman entered, stamping snow from her boots. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair pinned severely back and an angular, intelligent face. Miss Marple did not recognize her. "Ah, Miss Whitfield," the vicar called out, hastening forward. "How good of you to come. Everyone, this is Miss Lucy Whitfield, our new assistant librarian. She's only just arrived in the village last month." Miss Whitfield smiled politely, though it did not quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for including me, Vicar. I'm still finding my way about." "You must let me introduce you properly," Mrs. Lane said, already moving forward with the determined hospitality of a vicar's wife as she led Miss Whitfield around the room. Miss Marple watched the young woman's reactions carefully. When introduced to Mr. Hale, there was the briefest pause, a flicker of something in her expression that might have been recognition, or perhaps assessment. Mr. Hale's response was equally interesting. His hand, when he shook hers, was withdrawn, rather more quickly than courtesy strictly required, and a faint colour rose in his pale cheeks. "Delighted," he said, though his tones suggested quite the opposite. Miss Marple returned her attention to the tree. It was shaping up quite beautifully. The coloured glass ornaments caught the firelight, sending little prisms of colour dancing across the walls. The scent of pine filled the room, mingling with the smell of the mince pies Mrs. Lane had warming in the kitchen. "Miss Marple, look." Peggy's voice rang out with childish excitement. "There's another present, but I didn't put it." There, the little girl was pointing at a parcel wrapped in deep green paper and tied with red twine. It sat slightly apart from the others, nestled against the trunk of the tree where the shadows were deepest. Miss Marple bent down, her knees protesting slightly. The parcel was of medium size, quite neatly wrapped. The paper had a faint sheen to it, and the twine was tied in an unusually elaborate knot. Chapter 2. A gift with no name. The mysterious parcel remained beneath the tree for the remainder of the afternoon, a silent presence that seemed to draw everyone's eyes, despite their best efforts to ignore it. Miss Marple had resumed her knitting, but her needles moved with a distracted rhythm quite unlike their usual steady tempo. She was thinking of that not hand, of the way Mr. Hale had recoiled when young. Peggy first pointed out the package. Tea was served at 4 o'clock, and the conversation, which had been somewhat strained, gradually resumed its natural flow. Mrs. Lane proved herself an admirable hostess, steering discussion towards safe topics: the carol service planned for Christmas Eve, the state of the church roof, Dr. Haydock's new motor car. Only Miss Whitfield remained largely silent, nursing her cup with an abstracted air that suggested her thoughts were elsewhere entirely. "We really ought to sort out the raffle parcels properly," Mrs. Lane announced as the clock struck 4. "Mrs. Bantry has promised to draw the winning tickets at the church social on Sunday, and I should hate for there to be any confusion." "Quite right," the vicar agreed, setting down his teacup. "Shall we make a list? Someone ought to record who brought what for the thank-you notes." This sensible suggestion was met with general approval, and soon the company had gathered around the Christmas tree once more. Mrs. Winthrop produced a small notebook from her handbag, licking the tip of her pencil in a businesslike manner that reminded Miss Marple of the village schoolmistress examining her register. One by one, the parcels were identified. Mrs. Lane had contributed a set of embroidered handkerchiefs. Dr. Haydock, a bottle of his late father's port. Old Mr. Finch had wrapped one of his handcrafted wooden puzzles. Even the children had their offerings. Peggy, a little doll she had dressed herself. Tom, a collection of interesting stones he had polished. And young Robert, a set of tin soldiers painted with painstaking care. But when they came to the green-wrapped parcel with its red twine, silence fell once again. "Well," said the vicar, clearing his throat, "I suppose we must open it. Perhaps there's a card inside indicating the donor." Mrs. Lane looked uncertain. "It does seem rather presumptuous, opening someone's gift before the raffle." "Under the circumstances," Dr. Haydock said in his practical way, "I think it's justified. We can hardly raffle off something when we don't know what it is or who provided it." Mr. Hale, who had been standing well back from the tree, moved even farther away. "I really must be going," he said abruptly. "The evening choir practice, you know. I ought to prepare." "But surely you can spare a few more minutes," Mrs. Lane protested. "It won't take a moment." The choirmaster hesitated, and in that hesitation, Miss Marple read something very like fear. His eyes darted to the parcel, then away again, and his hands, she noticed, had developed that tremor once more. "Very well," he said at last, his voice tight. "But only a moment." The vicar picked up the mysterious package with the careful reverence he might afford a church artifact. The paper crackled slightly as he turned it over, searching for any indication of its origin. Finding none, he began to work at the elaborate knot. "Curious," he murmured. "This is tied rather firmly almost, as if whoever wrapped it wanted to be quite certain it wouldn't come undone accidentally." Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose from her chair. Something in the air had changed a tension that prickled at the back of her neck like the warning of an approaching storm. She had felt it before in situations that proved to be rather more serious than they first appeared. "Perhaps I might suggest," she began. But the vicar had already succeeded in loosening the knot. What happened next occurred with startling swiftness. As the twine fell away and the vicar began to fold back the green paper, there was a soft hissing sound, followed immediately by a burst of grey smoke that erupted from the package with sufficient force to make the vicar drop it in alarm. Mrs. Lane shrieked. The children scrambled backward. Dr. Haydock lunged forward. But the smoke had already begun to dissipate, curling upward in lazy tendrils that caught the light from the fire. It carried with it an acrid chemical smell that made Miss Marple's nose wrinkle. Good heavens! The vicar gasped, waving his hand before his face. What on earth? Is anyone hurt? Dr. Haydock demanded, his professional instincts immediately engaged. He examined the vicar's hands, then checked on Mrs. Lane and the children in turn. But the smoke, alarming though it had been, appeared to have caused no injury beyond startled nerves. Mr. Hale had gone absolutely rigid, his face drained of all colour. Miss Whitfield, Miss Marple observed, had moved closer rather than retreating, her eyes fixed on the fallen parcel with an intensity that was quite remarkable. As the last of the smoke cleared, the remains of the package lay scattered on the floor. The green paper had been scorched in places, and a faint smell of sulphur lingered in the air. In the midst of the wreckage lay a single object that caught the firelight and threw it back in soft, silvery gleams. A pocket watch. Miss Marple moved forward, her joints cooperating better than they had any right to, and bent to examine it more closely without touching it. The watch was old, clearly well made, with an engraved silver case that had been polished by years of handling. On the back, visible even in the uncertain light, were initials worked in an elegant script. A.W. Arthur Whitcomb, she said quietly. The effect of these two words was electric. Mr. Hale made a sound, somewhere between a gasp and a groan. Mrs. Lane's hand flew to her mouth. Even the vicar, normally so composed, seemed at a loss for words. "That's impossible," Mr. Hale whispered. "It can't be. It went down with him when he drowned." Dr. Haydock had picked up the watch with his handkerchief, examining it with professional curiosity. "Certainly genuine," he said. "Late 19th century, I should say. Swiss movement, good quality. But why?" Mrs. Lane asked, her voice trembling. "Why would someone play such a cruel trick? And the smoke, that dreadful smoke, we might have been hurt." "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that the smoke was precisely the point. A magician's distraction, you might say. Make a great fuss about one thing so that people don't look too closely at another." The vicar had recovered some of his composure. "This is most disturbing. Most disturbing indeed. I believe we ought to telephone Inspector Craddock. This seems rather beyond the scope of a village matter," Dr. Haydock agreed, "and no one should touch anything else. The inspector will want to see it exactly as it is." As the vicar hurried to his study to make the call, Miss Marple continued to study the scene before her, the scorched paper, the red twine now lying limp on the floor, the watch gleaming in Dr. Haydock's careful grip. But there was something else, something that nagged at the edge of her consciousness. "Mrs. Lane," she said, "when you stored the decorations after last Christmas, did you notice anything unusual, anything out of place?" The vicar's wife looked puzzled. "Why, no, I don't believe so, though. I must confess, it's been such a long time that I can hardly remember the details. And the whole cupboard where they were kept has been locked all year." "Oh, yes, the vicar keeps the key on his ring. There are valuable items in there. You see the silver candlesticks and the like." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The watch hadn't been in the parcel when it was supposedly placed under the tree. Someone in this very room must have brought it today, wrapped it during a moment when others were distracted, and slipped it beneath the tree with the other gifts. But who, and more importantly, why now, after 10 years? She glanced around at the assembled faces. Mr. Hale looked as though he might faint at any moment. Miss Whitfield's expression remained unreadable, though her hands were clenched tightly at her sides. Mrs. Winthrop was comforting the children, who were more excited than frightened by the unusual turn of events. Old Mr. Finch sat very still in his armchair, watching everything with those sharp old eyes. I think Miss Marple said more to herself than anyone else. That someone wanted us to know that Arthur Whitcomb didn't simply drown, or perhaps that someone knows what really happened that night 10 years ago. Mr. Hale swayed slightly, and Dr. Haydock moved quickly to support his elbow. Steady on, man. You'd better sit down. But the choir master shook off the doctor's hand with unexpected vehemence. I must go, he said again, his voice strained. I really must go. The choir practice, surely, under the circumstances, Mrs. Lane began, but Mr. Hale was already moving toward the door, his gait unsteady but determined. The vicar returned from his study just as the front door closed behind the choir master. Inspector Craddock is coming at once, he reported. He says no one is to leave until he arrives. He looked around the room. Where is Mr. Hale? Gone, Dr. Haydock said grimly, and in rather a hurry, I might add. Miss Marple had returned to her chair and taken up her knitting once more, but her mind was far from the simple pattern of stitches. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily now, muffling the world in white silence. Inside the vicarage, the Christmas tree stood in its festive splendor, but the scattered remains of that mysterious package lay on the floor like an accusation. The watch ticked steadily in Dr. Haydock's hand, measuring the moments with mechanical precision. It had survived 10 years in whatever hiding place had kept it safe. Now it had emerged, brought forth by someone with purpose and planning. Miss Marple thought again of that elaborate knot, the careful wrapping, the theatrical smoke. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to stage this revelation. The question was, who had the most to gain from resurrecting the memory of Arthur Whitcomb's death? Or perhaps, she reflected, pulling her wool through with practiced ease, the better question was, who had the most to lose? Chapter 3. The watch that shouldn't exist in Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, bringing with him the cold night air and a dusting of snow on his overcoat. He was a man in his early 40s, tall and lean, with the sort of patient, methodical manner that Miss Marple had always found reassuring in those whose profession required them to uncover unpleasant truths. Miss Marple, he said, greeting her with genuine warmth. I might have known you'd be in the midst of things. You seem to have a positive talent for being present when mysteries occur. Merely coincidence, Inspector, Miss Marple replied mildly, though I confess this particular mystery has some rather unusual features. The inspector listened carefully as the vicar recounted the afternoon's events, making notes in his leather pocketbook. Dr. Haydock handed over the watch, which Craddock examined with professional interest, turning it this way and that in the lamplight. A W. Arthur Whitcomb, he read aloud. I remember the case, though I was quite junior then. Presumed drowned in the village pond during a storm. Nobody recovered. He looked up at the assembled company. Rather peculiar that his watch should turn up no end in such a dramatic fashion. Most peculiar, Miss Marple agreed. She had been studying the watch case while the inspector held it. If I might make an observation, Inspector, please do. Your observations have proven remarkably useful in the past. Miss Marple rose and approached, indicating a spot near the hinge of the watch case. You'll notice there's a slight discoloration here, Sud, unless I'm very much mistaken. And if you smell it carefully, Craddock sniffed delicately. A scorched smell. Not fresh, though. This is old burning, I should say. Quite so, Miss Marple said, which suggests the watch may have been exposed to fire at some point, but survived. The mechanism still works, you see. Dr. Haydock heard it ticking, Curious, the inspector said. He opened the watch case with care. Inside, the works were visibly intricate and delicate, still keeping time after all these years, but something else caught his attention. Hello, what's this? On the interior of the case, barely visible in the dim light, were faint scratches. They formed letters, crude, but deliberate, as though someone had used a pin or similar implement to carve. Then Miss Marple produced her spectacles from her knitting bag and peered closely. Look under the floorboard, she read aloud. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Mrs. Lane clutched her husband's arm. Even young Peggy, who had been nodding off in her mother's lap, perked up with interest. These marks are recent, Craddock said slowly. You can see where the metal's been scraped. Whoever did this wanted to leave a message, but didn't want it discovered too quickly. A message hidden inside another message, Miss Marple observed. The smoke and the watch itself were meant to capture everyone's attention, while the real clue lay concealed within, rather like a Russian doll, one might say. But what floorboard? Mrs. Lane asked, bewildered. There are floorboards throughout the entire vicarage. Miss Marple had been considering this very question. I think, she said carefully, that the placement of the parcel may be significant. It was found beneath the Christmas tree, nestled against the trunk in the shadows. If someone wished to indicate a particular floorboard, placing the watch directly above it would be the logical approach. Inspector Craddock wasted no time. With the vicar's permission, he moved aside the lower branches of the tree and examined the floor beneath. The boards were old oak, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, but otherwise unremarkable. I don't see anything obvious, he admitted. If I might suggest, Miss Marple said. Bending down with some difficulty, the light was quite dim in this spot when the parcel was discovered. Perhaps if we were to look more carefully, her keen eyes had caught what the others had missed. Near the base of the tree, where shadow met firelight, was a small dark stain on the wood. She touched it lightly with one finger and examined the result. Ink, she pronounced. Fresh ink, I should say. No more than a day or two old. Dr. Haydock knelt beside her. You're quite right. Someone must have spilled it recently. But why would anyone be writing near the Christmas tree? Perhaps they weren't writing, Miss Marple suggested. Perhaps they were marking something. Inspector Craddock produced a penknife and carefully inserted it into the crack between boards near the ink stain. With gentle pressure, he pried upward. The board lifted with surprising ease, revealing a dark space beneath. Well now, he said quietly, this board's been lifted before, and recently, too. The nails have been worked loose. He reached into the cavity and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and stained with damp. Unfolding it carefully on the vicar's desk, they could see it was a torn page from a ledger, the kind used for accounting. The writing was faded, but still legible. Miss Marple read over the inspector's shoulder. Debts owed £15.10 to G. Hale. Interest compounded monthly. Final notice. The date at the top of the page was December 1915, 10 years previous to the month. G. Hale, Mrs. Lane whispered. That would be Gregory Hale Arthur, Whitcomb's nephew, and the man who inherited his estate when he was declared legally dead, Dr. Haydock added, his voice grim. Inspector Craddock carefully folded the ledger page and placed it in an evidence envelope he'd produced from his coat. I think I need to have a conversation with Mr. Hale, though I notice he left rather precipitously before my arrival. He seemed most disturbed by the watch, Miss Marple said. He claimed it was impossible for it to exist, that it had gone down with his uncle, which suggests, of course, that he knew his uncle was wearing the watch on the night of his disappearance, or thought he knew, the inspector replied. The question is, how did the watch survive if Arthur Whitcomb drowned? And who's been keeping it hidden all these years? Miss Marple returned to her chair, her mind working through the implications. The watch, the smoke, the hidden ledger page-all of it had been carefully orchestrated. Someone wanted these things discovered, wanted the past brought back to light. But who? And more importantly, what did they hope to achieve? "Inspector," she said slowly, "a smoke device suggests someone with a degree of chemical knowledge, at least access to such materials. The sort of thing one might purchase from a chemist, perhaps, or find in a schoolroom for demonstrations. Or," Dr. Haydock interjected, "the sort of thing a choirmaster might have access to. They use smoke effects occasionally for church pageants. I remember there was quite a spectacular representation of Moses in the burning bush 2 years ago. Did Mr. Hale arrange that?" "Catastrophic smoke machine," Mrs. Lane confirmed. "He's always been most particular about the theatrical elements of our Christmas and Easter presentations." The inspector made another note. "I'll need to speak with everyone who was present this afternoon, Mrs. Winthrop. If you wouldn't mind waiting, and you, Miss Whitfield. If you're still here." Miss Whitfield, who had remained silent throughout the inspector's examination, stepped forward from the corner where she had been standing. In the lamplight, her face looked pale and drawn. "Of course, Inspector, though I fear I can tell you very little. I only arrived in St. Mary Mead last month, and I knew nothing of Arthur Whitcomb's death until this afternoon. Still, you were present when the parcel was opened. Sometimes a fresh pair of eyes notices things others might miss." Miss Marple studied the young woman as she spoke with Inspector Craddock. There was something about Miss Whitfield that troubled her sense of concealed purpose. Beneath the surface politeness, the name Whitfield was not uncommon. Of course, but the coincidence of a newcomer arriving just before this dramatic revelation was perhaps worth noting. "Miss Marple," the vicar said, approaching her chair, "I do apologize for what was meant to be a pleasant afternoon of decorating. I can't imagine what possessed someone to stage such a disturbing scene in our vicarage." "My dear vicar," Miss Marple replied, "I suspect that whoever arranged this felt they had very good reasons indeed. The question we must ask ourselves is, what did they hope to accomplish? To frighten someone? To force a confession? Or simply to ensure that an old wrong was finally brought to light?" Through the window, she could see the snow falling steadily, blanketing the village in pristine white. But beneath that peaceful surface, she knew old secrets lay buried like the watch beneath the floorboard, and someone, after 10 years of silence, had decided it was time for those secrets to emerge. The Christmas tree stood in its corner, still festive, still beautiful, but now transformed into something else entirely, a stage where the past had come calling, bearing gifts that no one wished to receive. Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking rhythm. The watch that shouldn't exist had brought with it questions that demanded answers. And somewhere in the village, she was quite certain someone was waiting to see what those answers might reveal. Chapter 4. Tea with the choirmaster. The following afternoon found Miss Marple making her way along the high street, her sturdy umbrella serving double duty as both protection against the intermittent snow flurries and support for her careful navigation of the icy patches that made walking treacherous for someone of her years. She had dressed with particular care for this visit, choosing her good grey wool and the brooch that had belonged to her mother. One never knew when such small touches might put a nervous person at ease, and she suspected that Mr. Gregory Hale would be very nervous indeed. The choirmaster's cottage stood at the edge of the village, a neat stone building that had once been the dower house for the manor. It had come to Mr. Hale along with the rest of Arthur Whitcomb's modest estate, and he had, by all accounts, maintained it with the same meticulous attention he gave to everything else in his life. Miss Marple knocked firmly and waited. After a long moment, the door opened to reveal Mr. Hale himself, looking considerably more haggard than he had the previous day. His eyes were shadowed, and his collar, she noted, was not quite as crisp as one would expect from such a fastidious man. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice uncertain, "I wasn't expecting visitors." "I do apologize for calling without notice," Miss Marple replied with gentle politeness, "but I found myself walking this way, and I thought perhaps you might spare a few moments for tea. I have something of Mrs. Lane's that I promised to return to Eutho's sheets of music for the carol service. She asked me to bring them when I mentioned I might be passing by. It was a transparent fiction, and they both knew it. But convention demanded that such social niceties be observed, and Mr. Hale, whatever his other failings might be, was nothing if not conventional. "Of course," he said at last, stepping aside. "Please do come in." The interior of the cottage was exactly as Miss Marple had imagined it would be. Everything was arranged with mathematical precision, books aligned by height on their shelves, cushions placed at exact angles on the chairs. Even the fire irons hung with their handles parallel. It was the home of a man who sought to control his environment with rigid discipline, which suggested to Miss Marple's experienced eye a corresponding fear of disorder. "Please sit down," Mr. Hale said, gesturing to a wing chair near the fire. "I'll just put the kettle on." While he busied himself in the small kitchen, Miss Marple took the opportunity to observe her surroundings more carefully. The room was dominated by a handsome mahogany writing desk positioned beneath the window, its surface bearing only a blotter, an inkstand, and a small lamp. But what caught her attention was the locked drawer on the right side, locked because she could see the keyhole but no key, and because Mr. Hale had glanced at it repeatedly, even as he moved about the room. On the mantelpiece were several photographs in silver frames. One showed a stern-looking man in late middle age, his expression suggesting someone unused to smiling for cameras. Arthur Whitcomb, Miss Marple presumed. The resemblance to his nephew was marked, the same narrow face, the same rather thin lips, though the uncle's eyes held a hardness that the nephew's lacked. Mr. Hale returned with a tea tray, his hands not quite steady as he set it down. "I must apologize for yesterday," he said as he poured. "I'm afraid the shock of seeing Uncle Arthur's watch rather overcame me. It was most unseemly to leave as I did." "Perfectly understandable," Miss Marple assured him, accepting her cup. "It must have been quite disturbing. Milk, no sugar, thank you. You were close to your uncle, I understand." "Yes, that is," he hesitated, and Miss Marple saw his eyes dart once more toward that locked drawer. "He was my guardian after my parents died. I was only 15. He took me in, saw to my education, everything." "How very fortunate for you," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. It was good quality, she noted, and properly brewed. "His death must have been a terrible blow." "It was," Mr. Hale said. He set down his own cup, untouched. The circumstances were particularly dreadful. A winter storm, you see. He'd gone out to the pond. He often walked there in the evenings, even in poor weather. He said it helped him think. The next morning, His hat was found floating near the deeper part, but nothing else. They dragged the pond for days. No body was ever recovered. No, the mud, you see. The bottom is quite treacherous. Inspector Craddock, rather the inspector before him, concluded that Uncle Arthur had slipped on the icy bank and fallen in. Unable to find purchase in the mud, he would have Mr. Hale's voice trailed off. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. How very distressing for you. And yet the watch. If he drowned wearing it, how extraordinary that it should reappear now and in such working order. The effect of her words was immediate. Mr. Hale's face, already pale, became absolutely white. He stood abruptly, nearly knocking over the tea table, and moved to the window, his back to her. "I don't know," he said, his voice strained. "I can't explain it. Unless he didn't have it with him that night after all. Perhaps he'd left it somewhere, and someone found it. But you said yesterday that it went down with him. Those were your exact words. As I recall, it went down with him when he drowned." The silence that followed was profound. Outside, a bird called once, sharply, then fell silent. The fire crackled in the grate, and somewhere in the cottage a clock ticked with measured persistence. "I assumed," Mr. Hale said finally, still not turning around. "He always wore it. He was never without it. My grandfather's watch, you see. Swiss, very valuable. So naturally, I assumed." But Miss Marple had noticed something. As Mr. Hale had risen so precipitously, his hand had brushed against the desk, and for just a moment he had steadied himself by gripping its edge. His fingers had touched the locked drawer with a familiarity that spoke of habit of checking, of ensuring it remained secure. "Mr. Hale," she said gently, "I wonder if I might trouble you for a bit more hot water. This tea is quite excellent, but I do find it a trifle strong for my taste." It was an obvious pretext to send him from the room, but he seized upon it with evident relief. The moment he disappeared into the kitchen, Miss Marple moved with surprising swiftness for a woman of her age. She didn't approach the desk that would have been most improper from her new vantage point near the mantelpiece. She could see what had been hidden from her previous position. On the blotter lay a single piece of paper covered with writing. The hand was agitated, letters crossed out and rewritten. From this distance, she could make out only a few words. "Cannot continue. Conscience. And most tellingly, forgive me." She was back in her chair, appearing perfectly serene, when Mr. Hale returned with the hot water. "Thank you so much," she said, diluting her tea. "You're most kind. I was just admiring these photographs. Your uncle appears to have been a distinguished-looking gentleman. He had very high standards," Mr. Hale said, his voice tight, for himself and for others. "He believed in discipline, in meeting one's obligations, financial obligations, for instance." The question hung in the air between them. Mr. Hale's hand, reaching for his teacup, froze mid-gesture. "I beg your pardon." "Oh, I was merely thinking of that ledger page that was found yesterday. Debts owed, £15 a considerable sum 10 years ago, particularly with the interest compounding. I wonder if your uncle was often in the position of lending money to family members." "I know nothing about that paper," Mr. Hale said quickly, too quickly. "It could be anything, a forgery, perhaps, or a record of some other transaction entirely." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed placidly, "though the handwriting did look remarkably like that in the photographs of your uncle's correspondence that were published at the time of his death. The vicar showed them to me once. Your uncle wrote such a clear, distinctive hand, rather like yours, actually. I suppose such things run in families. Mr. Hale stood again, this time making no pretense of courtesy. Miss Marple, I'm afraid I must ask you to excuse me. I've just remembered an urgent matter requiring my attention, the music for Sunday's service. Of course, Miss Marple gathered her things with unhurried dignity. I've taken up quite enough of your time. Thank you for the tea. It was most illuminating diamine, most refreshing. As she reached the door, she paused and turned back. There is just one other small thing, if you don't mind. That night your uncle died were you home. I was at choir practice, he said automatically. We rehearsed until quite late, 9:30 at least. And afterward I came straight home. The vicar can confirm it. He locked up the church and saw me to the gate. How very thorough of you both, Miss Marple said. Good afternoon, Mr. Hale, as she made her way back along the high street. Her mind was already sorting through what she had learned. The locked drawer, the agitated letter on the blotter, the 2 quick denials, and the defensive explanations, and most interesting of all, that automatic response about the night of Arthur Whitcomb's death, the response of someone who had told the same story many times before until it had become a rehearsed litany. But there was something else that troubled her, some she had seen in Mr. Hale's face when she mentioned the watch. Not merely shock or fear, but something that looked very much like recognition, as though he had known all along exactly where that watch had been for the past 10 years. And if he had known that, what else might he know about the night his uncle disappeared beneath the dark waters of the village pond? Chapter 5. The ink-stained Miss Marple had barely removed her coat and settled into her favourite chair at home when there came a knock at the door. Her faithful maid, Lucy, showed in Inspector Craddock, who looked as though he had been doing a great deal of walking in the cold. Inspector, how nice to see you. Lucy, would you bring tea, please? The inspector looks as though he could use something warming. You're very perceptive, Miss Marple, Craddock said with a slight smile as he took the offered seat. I've been making inquiries all morning, and I confess I'm no further forward than I was yesterday evening. But sometimes one must go backward before one can go forward, Miss Marple observed. Rather like knitting. If you discover an error several rows down, there's nothing for it but to unravel and begin again from the point where things went wrong. A useful analogy. I've been speaking with various villagers about Arthur Whitcomb's death 10 years ago. The picture that emerges is complicated. Most pictures of human nature are, Miss Marple said. People are so rarely as simple as they first appear. What have you learned? The inspector pulled out his notebook as Lucy returned with the tea tray. Once she had withdrawn, he consulted his notes with a frown. Arthur Whitcomb was not, it seems, a particularly beloved figure in St. Mary Mead. He was respected. Certainly, he'd inherited a modest property and managed it well. He was also known for being harsh in financial matters. He loaned money to several villagers over the years, always at interest, and was quite unforgiving about repayment schedules, including his nephew. Especially his nephew, according to the old vicar's diary. I've been reading through the parish records. There are several entries suggesting that Gregory Hale was deeply in debt to his uncle, and that Arthur had threatened to disinherit him if the debt wasn't repaid by Christmas of 1915. Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands. The very month he died. How convenient for Mr. Hale, quite. And when Arthur Whitcomb was declared legally dead after 7 years, young Gregory inherited everything: the cottage, the investments, even a small insurance policy. He was able to pay off all his debts and establish himself comfortably as choirmaster. One might almost say he had a motive for murder, Miss Marple said quietly, though of course, proving such a thing after 10 years would be quite impossible without considerably more evidence. That's precisely the difficulty. The original investigation concluded accidental death. There was a storm that night. The pond was icy, and Arthur Whitcomb was known to walk there despite the weather. No one thought to question it too closely. Miss Marple set down her cup. "Inspector, would you mind very much if I asked you to accompany me to the vicarage? There's something about that ink stain that has been troubling me, and I should like to examine it again in better light." Craddock looked surprised but agreeable. "Of course, though I examined the area quite thoroughly last night. The floorboard had clearly been lifted recently, but beyond that, indulge an old woman's curiosity." "Mr. Craddock," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile. 20 minutes later, they stood once more in the vicarage sitting room, where the Christmas tree still occupied its corner though some of its festive cheer had been diminished by recent events. Mrs. Lane had gone to visit a parishioner, and the vicar was in his study, leaving them free to examine the scene undisturbed. Miss Marple knelt beside the tree with some difficulty, waving away the inspector's offer of assistance. The ink stain was still visible on the floor border, small dark blot that had seeped slightly into the grain of the wood. "You see," she said, producing a magnifying glass from her handbag. "The interesting thing about ink is that it behaves quite differently depending on the surface. On paper, it's absorbed quickly. On wood, particularly old, well-polished wood like this, it tends to bead and spread." She examined the stain closely. "This ink fell in drops, not in a stream. And look here," she indicated the edge of the floorboard. "There are faint scratches around the edge, as though someone used a tool to pry it up. Fresh scratches, I should say, given that the wood is lighter where it's been marked." Inspector Craddock knelt beside her. "You're suggesting someone lifted this board recently, found the ledger page, and in the process spilled ink. Or," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "someone lifted the board to place the ledger page there, and the ink was already on their fingers from having recently handled it. But the page itself was water-damaged and yellowed. It looks genuinely old." "Oh, I have no doubt it was genuinely old. But that doesn't mean it's been hidden beneath this particular floorboard for 10 years. Someone might have kept it elsewhere, in a drawer, perhaps, or among other papers, and only recently decided to place it here to be found." The inspector sat back on his heels. "You're saying this entire scene was staged? The watch, the smoke, the hidden ledger page? I'm saying that someone went to a great deal of trouble to ensure these items would be discovered in a particular sequence and in a particular way. The dramatic smoke to capture everyone's attention, the watch to evoke memory and shock, and then the hidden message leading to the ledger page. It's almost theatrical, wouldn't you say?" "Rather like a church pageant," Craddock murmured, echoing Dr. Haydock's observation from the previous evening. Miss Marple carefully pushed herself to her feet, accepting the inspector's arm this time. "The question we must ask ourselves is, what did the person who arranged all this hope to achieve? Were they trying to expose the truth about Arthur Whitcomb's death? Or were they attempting to frame someone for a crime that may never have occurred?" She moved slowly around the tree, examining the floor from different angles. "When exactly did you say the decorating party began yesterday?" "According to Mrs. Lane, people started arriving around 2 o'clock. The decorating proper began about past. and before that was the room unattended at all. Craddock consulted his notes. Mrs. Lane had been in and out all morning preparing. The vicar was in his study from 10 until lunchtime. After lunch, Mrs. Lane went upstairs to change, and the vicar went out to visit old Mrs. Henderson, who's been unwell. The room was empty for perhaps 30 minutes. Long enough, Miss Marple said, for someone to slip in, lift the floorboard, place the ledger page, and mark the spot with ink. They might even have brought the wrapped parcel with them hidden beneath a coat and placed it under the tree while still alone. But how would they have entered? The vicar locks the front door when the house is empty. Does he lock the French windows? Miss Marple moved to the tall windows that looked out onto the vicarage garden. I seem to recall Mrs. Lane mentioning that the latch has been troublesome. The inspector tried the handle. The window opened smoothly. No lock at all, he said grimly. Anyone could have entered from the garden. Miss Marple peered out into the snow-covered garden. The fresh snowfall had obliterated any footprints that might have been there. Yesterday, but the bare outline of a path was still visible, leading from the garden gate toward the house. There's something else, she said slowly. That ink stain bothered me from the moment I saw it tanned. I've only just realized why. It's the wrong color. I beg your pardon. The vicar uses blue-black ink. I've seen his correspondence. But this stain, she indicated the mark on the floor, is pure black India ink. I should save the sort artists use, or music copyists. The inspector's expression sharpened. Gregory Hale copies music for the choir. He's quite particular about it, won't let anyone else do it. Indeed, India ink is essential for such work. It doesn't fade or run when exposed to moisture. Miss Marple moved back to her examination of the floorboard, which brings us to another interesting question. This board was lifted with some force. You can see where the wood has splintered slightly. But the person who did it tried to be careful. They used something flat and thin to pry it up, not a crowbar or anything crude. She straightened, her eyes distant with thought. Someone familiar with delicate works, someone patient and methodical, someone who at MERS understands the importance of precision. You're building quite a case against Gregory Hale, Craddock observed. Am I? Or am I merely observing what's here to be seen? Miss Marple moved back toward the fireplace, where her knitting bag rested on the chair she'd occupied yesterday. The difficulty, Inspector, is determining whether Mr. Hale staged this revelation to divert suspicion from himself, for whether someone else staged it to cast suspicion upon him. The question of motive remains, Craddock said. If Hale murdered his uncle 10 years ago, why would he risk exposing that crime now by bringing the watch and ledger page to light? He wouldn't, Miss Marple said simply, which suggests that someone else is responsible for yesterday's theatrical display, someone who knew about the watch, knew about the debt, and knew enough about what happened 10 years ago to construct this elaborate accusation. She turned to face the inspector directly. The real question, I think, is not who arranged yesterday's surprise. The real question is, how did they come by Arthur Whitcomb's watch in the first place? Inspector Craddock was silent for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. If Whitcomb did drown that night, the watch should have been with him at the bottom of the pond. Yes, but if he didn't drown, if he was killed some other way, then the watch might have been taken by his murderer, kept perhaps as insurance or forgotten in a drawer somewhere. Or, Miss Marple said quietly, discovered by someone who understood its significance and decided, after 10 years, that justice should finally be served. Outside, the December afternoon was drawing toward dusk, the pale light fading rapidly. In the vicarage sitting room, the Christmas tree stood witness to their deliberations, its ornaments catching the last of the daylight and throwing it back in fractured gleams of red and gold and silver dot. Miss Marple gathered her things, her mind already moving ahead to the next thread that wanted unraveling. Someone in St. Mary Mead knew the truth about Arthur Whitcomb's death, that someone had decided, for reasons of their own, that the time had come for secrets to surface. The question was, would the truth, when it finally emerged, prove to be a gift or a curse? Chapter 6. The Locked Cupboard. Morning brought with it a hard frost that turned the village into something resembling a Christmas cardle, silver edges and diamond-bright icicles hanging from eaves. Miss Marple, practical as always, had chosen her sturdiest boots for the walk to the vicarage, where she had arranged to meet Mrs. Lane for what she had described as a small favour regarding the Christmas decorations. In truth, she wished to examine the hall cupboard where the decorations had been stored. An experience had taught her that one could accomplish a great deal under the guise of being helpful. Mrs. Lane greeted her warmly, though the vicar's wife still looked rather shaken by the events of 2 days previous. "It's all been so dreadfully upsetting, Miss Marple. I can hardly sleep for thinking about that poor man's watch appearing like that. And to think someone crept into our home and lifted up the very floorboards." Most distressing, Miss Marple agreed with genuine sympathy. "But I'm sure Inspector Craddock will get to the bottom of it. In the meantime, I wondered if I might help you sort through the remaining decorations. I noticed you have some lovely old ornaments that might benefit from careful cleaning before they're put away for another year. How thoughtful of you, I must confess. The idea of going through that cupboard again gives me quite a turn. To think someone might have been hiding things there all along. Shall we look together?" Miss Marple suggested gently. "I find these things are always less frightening when faced with company." The whole cupboard was located beneath the stairs, a deep space that extended back into shadows. Mrs. Lane unlocked it with a key from a and the door swung open with a faint creak that spoke of hinges in need of oil. "There," Mrs. Lane said, standing well back. "I've hardly been able to bring myself to open it since yesterday." Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. The cupboard was neatly organized, as one might expect from Mrs. Lane's capable management. Boxes of decorations were stacked on the left side, clearly labelled in a careful hand. Church linens occupied the centre shelves, and the right side held various items for church functions, candlesticks, collection plates, and several heavy coats that appeared to be kept for parishioners who might arrive at services insufficiently dressed for the weather. "These coats," Miss Marple said, indicating the garments hanging from hooks at the back, "are they often used?" "Oh, from time to time. The vicar keeps them here for anyone who might need them. Some of them have been there for years. People donate them, you see, and we never quite get around to sorting through them properly." Miss Marple began to examine the coats with methodical care, checking pockets and studying the fabric. The first 2 yielded nothing of interest, nor did the third, but the fourth coat, a heavy winter overcoat of dark wool, felt peculiar to the touch. "Mrs. Lane, would you mind bringing a lamp? I can't quite see properly in this light." When the lamp arrived, Miss Marple's suspicions were confirmed. The coat was not merely old, but damaged stiff in places, as though it had been thoroughly soaked and then dried without proper care. The fabric had a peculiar rigidity that spoke of water damage, and when she lifted it to examine more closely, she caught a faint, musty smell. "How very strange," she murmured, feeling carefully through the pockets. In the deep right pocket, Her fingers encountered something solid. She withdrew a folded piece of paper, its edges brittle with age. Unfolding it carefully in the lamplight, she saw it was a hand-drawn map, crude but effective, showing the village pond and the surrounding area. An X had been marked on one section of the water near what appeared to be the deeper eastern end. Good gracious, Mrs. Lane breathed, looking over her shoulder. What on earth is that doing here? A very good question indeed, Miss Marple said. She examined the map more closely. The paper was of good quality, the sort used for correspondence, and the ink, though faded, appeared to be the same blue-black that the vicar used. Mrs. Lane, might this be your husband's handwriting? Mrs. Lane studied it, then shook her head. No, that's not Leonard's hand. It's far too cramped and angular. Leonard writes with quite flourishing loops. Quite so, Miss Marple said. She turned her attention back to the coat itself. Do you happen to know how long this particular coat has been in the cupboard? I couldn't say with any certainty. As I mentioned, some of them have been here for years. We had a clear-out about 3 years ago, I believe, but this one must have escaped notice. It's pushed quite far back, you see. But Miss Marple was not convinced. The coat had not been pushed far back by accident or neglect. It had been deliberately concealed behind the other garments, but not destroyed, and the timing troubled her considerably. Mrs. Lane, forgive me for asking, but has anyone else had access to this cupboard recently? Anyone at all? The vicar's wife considered. Well, I opened it on the morning of the decorating party to fetch the boxes, and then it was locked again until just now. Before that, I can't recall anyone using it for weeks. Perhaps at the Harvest Festival in September, but that's months ago. And who has keys to this cupboard? Only Leonard and myself, though, I suppose. She paused, frowning. The keys do hang in the kitchen on their hooks when we're at home. Anyone visiting the vicarage might have access to them. Theoretically, though it would be most improper. Miss Marple carefully returned the map to the coat pocket and examined the garment once more. On the inner collar, nearly invisible in the poor light, was a name tape of the sort used in boarding schools or the military. She held it close to the lamp. A Whitcomb, she read aloud. Mrs. Lane gasped. Arthur Whit... But that's impossible. This coat has been here for years. You said it had water damage that was old, Miss Marple corrected gently. But I did not say it had been in this cupboard for years. In fact, I rather think it was placed here quite recently, perhaps even on the morning of the decorating party. But who would do such a thing, and why? Miss Marple carefully rehung the coat, positioning it exactly as she had found it. Someone who wishes us to believe that Arthur Whitcomb's coat survived his drowning, someone who had access to this coat, perhaps stored in an attic or cellar somewhere, and decided it should be discovered along with the watch and the ledger page. Another piece of evidence in a carefully constructed puzzle. She stepped back from the cupboard, her mind working through the implications. The map is particularly interesting. It marks a specific location in the pond. One might almost think it was indicating where something is hidden, or where someone was meant to believe something is hidden. You don't think Arthur Whitcomb's body might be there, do you, after all these years? Mrs. Lane looked faint at the prospect. I think, Mrs. Lane, that we are meant to wonder about that very question. But consider, if this map was drawn by Arthur Whitcomb himself, why would he mark a spot in the pond? If it was drawn by someone else, why would they keep such an incriminating document? Unless they kept it as proof of what really happened that night, Mrs. Lane whispered. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She was thinking of Gregory Hale's face when the watch had been revealed, with his nervous glances toward the locked drawer in his writing desk, of the agitated letter she had glimpsed on his blotter. She was thinking, too, of the fresh India ink stain beneath the vicarage floorboard and of how someone with knowledge and access had staged an elaborate revelation. But there was something else, something that had been nagging at her since her visit to Mr. Hale's cottage. The photograph on his mantelpiece had shown Arthur Whitcomb in a dark overcoat, the same style as the one now hanging in the vicarage cupboard. In the photograph, Arthur had been standing by the pond, his hands in his pockets, his expression severe. "Mrs. Lane," she said slowly, "you mentioned that items were donated to the cupboard for those in need. Might someone have donated this coat specifically, perhaps? Someone clearing out an old property or sorting through stored belongings?" "It's possible. People do leave things on the doorstep sometimes or hand them to Leonard after services. We don't always keep track of every donation." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Then we must consider that someone had Arthur Whitcomb's coat in their possession all these years, someone who knew it would be recognized if it were ever found, someone who has now decided it should be found along with all the other evidence they've so carefully arranged." She moved toward the door, her mind already leaping ahead to the next question that wanted answering. "I think, Mrs. Lane, that we should inform Inspector Craddock about this discovery. He'll want to have the coat examined properly. That map will certainly interest him." As they locked the cupboard and returned to the warmth of the sitting room, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the nature of evidence. Physical objects could be moved, planted, arranged to tell whatever story the arranger desired. A watch that shouldn't exist, a ledger page hidden beneath a floorboard, a water-damaged coat concealed in a cupboard, each item carefully placed, each discovery timed for maximum effect. But there was always a moment when even the cleverest arrangement revealed itself as artifice rather than truth. The trick was recognizing that moment, seeing past the surface to the intention beneath, and Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that the intention behind this elaborate staging was not what it first appeared to be. Someone was building a case against Gregory Hale, but were they doing so to expose a guilty man or to destroy an innocent one? The answer, she felt certain, lay not in the physical evidence itself, but in understanding who had the most to gain from resurrecting the memory of Arthur Whitcomb's death after 10 years of silence. Chapter 7. Footprints in the Snow Mist. Marple was just sitting down to her luncheon when young Billy Archer, the butcher's boy, who also served as messenger for anyone in the village who needed such services, appeared at her door with a note. Lucy showed him into the sitting room, where he stood clutching his cap and looking rather pleased with himself. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but Inspector Craddock asked me to bring you this and to wait for an answer if you had one." Miss Marple opened the envelope and read the brief message within. The inspector had examined the coat and wished to consult with her about a matter that had arisen from questioning the staff at the vicarage. He would call upon her at 2 o'clock if convenient. "Please tell the inspector that will suit me admirably," Miss Marple said, reaching for her purse to give the boy a sixpence. But Billy was shifting from foot to foot in a way that suggested he had something more on his mind. "If you please." Miss Sy couldn't help but overhear some folks talking about Mr. Hale and that business with the watch and all, and I thought I ought to mention something, seeing as it might be important. "Do sit down, Billy," Miss Marple said, gesturing to a chair. "Lucy will bring you some cake, I'm sure. Now, What is it you wanted to tell me? The boy sat on the edge of the chair, his cap twisted between his hands. Well, miss, it was the morning of the decorating party. I was making my rounds with the early deliveries, and I saw Mr. Hale coming from the direction of the vicarage. It must have been about 11, because I'd just left the Hendersons' cottage, and they always take their delivery at 1:15. Coming from the vicarage, you say? Was he carrying anything? Yes, miss, a parcel wrapped in brown paper, tied up with string. When he saw me, he seemed a bit startled. Then he said good morning, very polite, and told me it was a Christmas present for the choir boys that he'd been at the vicarage arranging with Mrs. Lane about when to distribute the gifts. Miss Marple's eyes had sharpened with interest. Did you notice what sort of string he used to tie the parcel? Billy considered. It was red, miss. I remember thinking it was festive-like, being Christmas and all red twine, proper, thick stuff. Thank you, Billy. That's very observant of you. Is there anything else you remember about that morning? The boy's face brightened. Well, now you mention it, miss, there was something odd. After Mr. Hale went on his way, I happened to go around the back of the vicarage to deliver to the kitchen door. Cook always wants her meat put straight in the larder, and I noticed there were footprints in the snow leading from the garden gate to the back of the house and then around to the side where those French windows are. Fresh footprints. Yes, miss, made that morning, I'd say, because it had snowed a bit overnight, and these were clear on top of the fresh snow. Man's boots, by the size of them. They went right up to the French windows, then back again toward the tool shed. Miss Marple rose from her chair with sudden energy. Billy, I wonder if you'd be so good as to show me these footprints, that is, if they haven't been completely covered by the subsequent snow. There's been no more snow since yesterday morning. Miss, they might still be visible, a bit filled in. 20 minutes later, Miss Marple found herself in the vicarage garden, well wrapped against the cold, with Billy pointing out the traces of footprints that remained. The boy had been quite right. A clear track led from the garden gate, which opened onto a lane behind the church, to the French windows of the sitting room, and then on toward the tool shed that stood in the far corner of the garden. Inspector Craddock, whom Billy had encountered on his way to Miss Marple's cottage, and who had joined their expedition, knelt to examine the prints more closely. Heavy boots, he confirmed. A man's size, certainly. And you're quite sure you saw Mr. Hale that morning, carrying a parcel tied with red twine? Yes, sir, I'd swear to it. The inspector straightened and exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. The parcel beneath the tree was tied with red twine. Indeed, Miss Marple said, and Mrs. Lane confirmed that the house was empty for approximately 30 minutes after luncheon, while she was upstairs and the vicar was out visiting. Ample time for someone to slip in through the unlocked French windows, lift the floorboard, place the ledger page, and position the wrapped parcel beneath the tree. They followed the footprints to the tool shed, where Craddock trod the door. It opened easily, revealing the usual collection of gardening implements, pots, and various items accumulated over years. But what immediately caught Miss Marple's attention was the small pile of ashes in one corner, grey and fine, as though something had been burned quite recently. The inspector knelt and examined them carefully, stirring them with a tweezer he'd picked up. Paper, certainly, and something else. Cloth, perhaps. The burning wasn't complete. Look here, he indicated a few larger fragments that had survived the fire. One appeared to be a corner of paper, with part of a word still visible. Comb, in faded ink. More of Arthur Whitcomb's papers, Miss Marple said quietly. Someone was destroying evidence. But why here in the vicarage tool shed? Why not burn them in one's own fireplace, where it would attract no attention? Unless, Craddock said slowly, the person doing the burning wanted to be certain no ash or fragment was left in their own home where it might be discovered. Burning papers in someone else's shed is considerably safer from that perspective. Miss Marple moved carefully around the small space, her eyes taking in every detail. On a shelf near the door, she noticed a smudge of what looked like soot, though someone had steadied themselves there with a dirty hand. And beneath the shelf, barely visible, was a small scrap of green paper, the same deep green as the wrapping on the mysterious parcel. She picked it up carefully and showed it to the inspector. It would appear that our friend did more than simply burn papers here. Perhaps this was where the parcel was wrapped, as well out of sight, with time to work carefully. But that suggests considerable premeditation, Craddock objected. This wasn't a spontaneous act. Someone planned this down to the smallest detail. Oh, indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Someone who thought through every step, who obtained the watch somehow, who retrieved the old ledger page and the coat, who created the smoke device, and who knew exactly when and how to stage the entire revelation. This is the work of a mind that plans ahead. Inspector, a mind that considers consequences. Billy, who had been listening with wide eyes, cleared his throat. Begging your pardon, Miss Burt, there's one other thing. When I saw Mr. Hale that morning, his hands were dirty like. I notice because he's usually so particular about his appearance, but his fingers had dark marks on them, as if he'd been handling something. Did you mention this to Mr. Hale? No, miss. Didn't seem my place to say anything. Inspector Craddock made careful notes of everything. I think, Miss Marple, that we have enough evidence now to bring Mr. Hale in for a formal questioning, the red twine. His presence near the vicarage at the relevant time, the soot on his hands. It all points rather damningly in his direction. But Miss Marple was frowning slightly, her eyes distant with thought. And yet, Inspector, don't you find it curious that Mr. Hale would be so careless? A man who plans such an elaborate revelation down to the last detail, who thinks to burn incriminating papers in someone else's shed rather than his own fireplace. Would such a man allow himself to be seen by the messenger boy carrying a distinctive parcel tied with red twine? People make mistakes when they're nervous, Craddock suggested. Perhaps, but consider what we know of Mr. Hale. He is meticulous, careful, a man who lives by routine and precision. Would such a person truly overlook being observed at a crucial moment? Or might he have wanted to be observed? The inspector looked startled. You're suggesting he wanted to incriminate himself? I'm suggesting that perhaps nothing is quite as it appears. We have been following a trail of evidence, Inspector, but trails can be laid as easily as they can be followed. Question is, who laid this particular trail and why? They walked back toward the vicarage in thoughtful silence, Belly, having been dismissed with thanks and another 6. The winter afternoon was drawing in, and lights were beginning to appear in cottage windows throughout the village. There's something else that troubles me, Miss Marple said as they reached the gate. The watch itself. You considered how the person who arranged all this came to possess Arthur Whitcomb's watch in the first place. I assume they took it from his body after killing him. But if Gregory Hale murdered his uncle 10 years ago, why would he keep the watch all this time? Why not dispose of it in the pond, along with the body? And if he did keep it, why would he then use it to incriminate himself? Now Craddock was silent for a moment. You're suggesting someone else had the watch? Someone who knew about the murder, or at least suspected it and kept the watch as evidence? Or, Miss Marple said gently, someone who found the watch more recently and understood. It's significant someone who has their own reasons for wanting the truth about Arthur Whitcomb's death to come to light after 10 years. As she made her way home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the nature of guilt and innocence of truth and the appearance of truth. Someone in St. Mary Mead had knowledge they had kept hidden for a decade. Someone had decided that Christmas was the season for revelations, that old sins should be brought into the light. But whether that someone was seeking justice or revenge, or perhaps something else entirely, remained yet to be discovered. Chapter 8. The Toymaker's Tale. The following morning brought with it a thin, pale sunshine that did little to warm the air, but cast everything in sharp relief, though the village had been etched in silver and grey. Miss Marple, having breakfasted early, decided that a visit to Mr. Oswald Finch was in order. The old toy maker had been present at the vicarage decorating party, and his rheumy but observant eyes had, she suspected, seen more than he had yet revealed. Mr. Finch's cottage stood on the outskirts of the village, a small, crooked building that looked as though it had grown organically from the earth, rather than been built by human hands. Smoke rose from its chimney in a steady plume, and through the windows Miss Marple could see the warm glow of lamplight despite the hour. The old man himself answered her knock, peering at her with those sharp eyes that belied his 80-odd years. "Miss Marple," he said, "I wondered when you might come calling. You have that look about youth, the one that says you're piecing things together, like one of my puzzles. You're very perceptive. Mr. Finch, I was hoping you might spare me a few moments of your time. Come in, come in. The cold's no friend to old Bones End. I suspect yours are complaining as much as mine." The interior of the cottage was a marvel of organized chaos. Every surface held evidence of the toy maker's craft: half-finished wooden soldiers, tiny carved animals, elaborate dollhouses, and mechanical toys of breathtaking intricacy. The scent of wood shavings and glue filled the air, mingling with the smoke from the fire that crackled cheerfully in the great dot. Mr. Finch settled into a worn armchair and gestured for Miss Marple to take its companion. "You'll be wanting to know about Arthur Whitcomb," he said without preamble, "about what really happened that night 10 years ago." Miss Marple concealed her surprise at his directness. "You knew Mr. Whitcomb, I understand. Knew him well enough. He commissioned work from me over the years, particular about it. He wanted wooden soldiers for his collection, painted just so, historically accurate down to the last button and buckle. Paid well, I'll give him that. But he was a hard man, hard and cold, like iron in winter." "Was he a collector, then?" "Oh, yes, military history, mainly. Had whole battles laid out in his study, or so I heard. Never saw it myself. He wasn't one for inviting people into his home. Preferred to collect his orders from my workshop." The old man's fingers moved unconsciously, as though shaping invisible wood. "But that last time I saw him, he was different, afraid." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Afraid of what?" "That's what I couldn't say for certain, but he came to my workshop just 2 days before he died. It was evening, near dark, and snowing. He looked over his shoulder when he knocked us, though someone might be following. Asked me if I'd seen his nephew about the village, that Da Gregory Hale. I told him I'd seen young Gregory at the church earlier, practicing with the choir. Arthur went quiet then and said something I'll never forget. He said, 'I've made a mistake. Fincher, terrible mistake. Now I don't know how to unmake it.'" The old man paused, staring into the fire. I asked him what he meant, but he wouldn't say. Just paid me for the soldiers I'd finished and left. That was the last time I saw him alive. Did you tell the police this at the time of his death?" Mr. Finch shook his head slowly. "Didn't seem relevant, did it? Everyone said he'd drowned in an accident and young Gregory had been at choir practice that night with witnesses. The vicar himself vouched for him. So I kept my counsel, thinking perhaps Arthur's fears were just an old man's fancies. But you don't think that now?" "I think," Mr. Finch said carefully, "that when a man says he's made a terrible mistake and 2 days later, he's found drowned in circumstances that were never quite explained to my satisfaction, then perhaps the mistake and the drowning are connected." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Mr. Finch, you were at the vicarage when the watch was discovered. Did you notice anything unusual? Anyone behaving oddly?" The old man's eyes grew distant with recollection. "That young woman, the new librarian, Miss Whitfield, isn't it? She was watching Gregory Hale, something fierce, and he knew it, too. Couldn't keep his eyes from darting her way like a nervous horse. When the watch came out of that parcel, she went very still, very intent, not shocked. Mind you, like the rest of us more, like someone seeing a plan come together." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Did she speak to anyone in particular?" "Kept herself apart, mostly, but I saw her slip something into her pocket when everyone was fussing about the smoke. A scrap of paper, I think, though I couldn't swear to it." Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. "Tell me, Mr. Finch, you mentioned that Arthur Whitcomb was afraid of his nephew. Did you ever witness any conflict between them?" The old man was quiet for so long that Miss Marple thought perhaps he hadn't heard the question. But then he spoke, his voice lower now, weighted with memory. "I saw them arguing once. It was the very night Arthur died, though I didn't know it at the time. I'd been working late in my shop, had a commission that needed finishing, and I went out for a breath of air before bed. Must have been around 9 o'clock. I heard voices raised in anger down by the pond. Could you make out what they were saying? Some of it. Arthur was shouting about debts and responsibility. Gregory was saying something about it being impossible, that he couldn't pay what was demanded. Then Arthur said these words, I remember clear as daylight, then you'll inherit nothing. I'll see to that. I'll change my will tomorrow and you'll not get a penny." Miss Marple's hands stilled on her knitting, which she had brought out of habit. "And what did Mr. Hale reply?" "He didn't, not that I heard. There was a silence and then I heard footsteps. Only one set, mind you, walking quickly away from the pond back toward the village. I thought perhaps Arthur had stormed off in anger, and Gregory had stayed behind to compose himself. So I went back inside and thought no more of it until the next morning, when Arthur Whitcomb's hat was found in the pond. And everyone said how he must have slipped on the icy bank and drowned. But I couldn't help wondering, if it was Arthur who walked away, why would he go back to the pond later? And if it was Gregory who walked away, then where was Arthur? The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, a bird called sharp and sudden, making Miss Marple start slightly. "Mr. Finch, why, have you never spoken of this before?" The old man's face was troubled. What was I to say? I heard arguing and footsteps. I didn't see what happened. Then the vicar swore Gregory was at choir practice until 9, then walked with him to the gate and saw him go home. How could Gregory be in 2 places at once? So I told myself I must have been mistaken about the time, more that the voices I heard were someone else entirely. But now I think perhaps the vicar was mistaken about when choir practice ended. Or perhaps Gregory slipped away earlier than he claimed and returned before anyone noticed. It's possible, isn't it? The church has to doorsound. The vicar's eyesight wasn't what it used to be even then. Miss Marple considered this carefully. The timeline was indeed problematic. If Gregory Hale had been at the pond arguing with his uncle at 9 o'clock, and if the vicar had seen him leave the church at 9, then either Mr. Finch was mistaken about the time, or the argument had happened earlier than he remembered, or someone was not telling the truth about Gregory's whereabouts. The footsteps you heard walking away from the pond, could you tell anything about them? Were they hurried? Hesitant? Hurried, he said, without hesitation, almost running the kind of pace a man makes when he's desperate to be away from something. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her mind already sorting through this new information and fitting it into the pattern that was slowly emerging. You've been most helpful. I wonder, though, if I might ask one more question. The wooden soldiers you made for Arthur Whitcomb, do you know what became of them? Gregory inherited them, along with everything else, though I heard he sold most of Arthur's collection a few years back. Needed the money for repairs to the cottage roof, for, so people said. As Miss Marple made her way back to the village, she found herself thinking about the nature of truth and the way memory could shift over time, reshaping itself to fit new understanding. Mr. Finch had kept his silence for 10 years, perhaps convincing himself that what he had witnessed was innocent, that his suspicions were unfounded. But the appearance of the watch had changed everything suddenly. Old memories took on new significance. What had seemed like a tragic accident now looked very much like something else entirely. The question remained: who had brought those memories back to light, and what did they hope to gain by doing so? Was it justice they sought, a revenge, or perhaps something more complex? Something that involved not just exposing the past, but reshaping it to serve present purposes. Miss Marple walked on through the cold morning, her mind occupied with puzzles within puzzles, and the growing certainty that the truth, when it finally emerged, would surprise everyone, possibly even herself. Chapter 9. The Gift Exchange Inspector arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just as she was finishing her account of the conversation with Mr. Oswald Finch. The inspector listened with his customary attention, making notes in his pocketbook and occasionally asking for clarification on a point of detail. So we have a witness who heard Whitcomb and Hale arguing at the pond on the night in question, he said when she had finished. That's significant, though. As Mr. Finch himself observed, it's not conclusive. The vicar's testimony about choir practice complicates matters considerably. Unless, Miss Marple said gently, the vicar was mistaken about the time. Memory can be a peculiar thing, Inspector, particularly when one is attempting to recall events from 10 years past. The old vicar has since died, so we cannot ask him to reconsider his recollection. True enough, but I found something else that may interest you. Craddock reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small notebook, well-worn and water-stained. This was hidden in the lining of Arthur Whitcomb's coat, the one we found in the vicarage cupboard. There's a torn edge that matches the ledger page found beneath the floorboard. Miss Marple took the notebook carefully and opened it to a random page. The writing was cramped and precise, listing various sums of money loaned and interest accrued. Names appeared throughout villagers. She recognized several of whom had since died or moved away, and recurring with disturbing frequency was one name in particular: Gregory Hale, £15 tens. She read aloud from an entry dated November 1915, plus accumulated interest from previous loans. Total amount owed, £23 for South, Final notice given. There are other entries that suggest Whitcomb had given his nephew multiple chances to repay, Craddock said. But by December, his patience had evidently run out. Look at the last entry. Miss Marple turned to the final written page, dated December 10th, 1915, just 3 days before Arthur Whitcomb's death. The writing here was more agitated, the letters less controlled. Greater than G refuses all terms. Will not listen to reason. Have told him he leaves me no choice. Will change testament tomorrow. He must learn consequences. So, Arthur Whitcomb intended to disinherit his nephew, Miss Marple said quietly, just as Mr. Finch reported hearing him say, but did he actually change his will? That's the curious part. According to the solicitor's records, Arthur Whitcomb's will was dated 1910 and never amended. Everything went to Gregory Hale upon his death, though of course, there was the 7-year wait before he could be declared legally dead and the estate settled, which gave Mr. Hale ample time to ensure no inconvenient amended will surfaced. Miss Marple observed, if one existed, he would have had opportunity to destroy it during those 7 years. The inspector nodded grimly. I've asked Hale to come to the vicarage at 3 o'clock this afternoon. I thought it best to confront him there, where the evidence was discovered. Will you join us, Miss Marple? Your insights have been invaluable thus far. I should be glad to, Miss Marple replied, though in truth she felt a growing unease about the case. Everything pointed too neatly toward Gregory Hale's guilt hand in her experience, when a puzzle appeared too simple. It was because one had not yet seen all the pieces at precisely 3 o'clock. Miss Marple found herself once again in the vicarage sitting room, where the Christmas tree stood in its corner like a witness to all that had transpired. Inspector Craddock was there, along with the vicar and Mrs. Lane. A constable stood quietly by the door. Gregory Hale arrived moments later, his face drawn and pale. He had aged visibly in the past few days, and his hands trembled as he removed his hat. Mr. Hale, Inspector Craddock began, thank you for coming. I've asked you here because new evidence has come to light regarding your uncle's death 10 years ago. I have nothing to hide. Hale said, though his voice lacked conviction. Then, perhaps you can explain why you were seen carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with red twine on the morning of the decorating party, the same red twine that was used to tie the mysterious parcel that appeared under the vicarage tree. Hale's face went if possibly even whiter. I told the boy it was a gift for the choir boys for Christmas, yet no such gift was ever distributed and none of the choir boys mentioned receiving anything from you. I changed my mind. Thought it better to wait until closer to Christmas. And the soot on your hands that same morning, the messenger boy noticed it particularly, as you're usually so fastidious about your appearance. Hale said nothing, his jaw working as though he was struggling to find words. We also have a witness, Craddock continued relentlessly, who heard you arguing with your uncle on the night of his death down by the pond around 9 o'clock. Terrible shouting, he said, and then only one set of footsteps coming back. That's not tie, wasn't Hale's composure finally broke. He sank into a chair, his face in his hands. I didn't kill him. I swear I didn't kill him. Miss Marple, who had been watching all this with careful attention, now spoke for the first time. But you were there that night, weren't you, Mr. Hale? At the pond, and something happened that you've kept secret all these years. Hale looked up at her, his eyes desperate. I was there. God help me, I was there, but I didn't kill him. Then what did happen? Craddock demanded. Before Hale could answer, there came a knock at the door. The constable opened it to reveal Miss Lucy Whitfield, the assistant librarian. She stepped into the room with quiet determination, and Miss Marple noted that her expression had changed entirely from the reserved politeness she had shown at the decorating party. Now there was something fierce in her face, something that had been hidden, but was hidden no longer. "I think, Miss Whitfield," she said clearly, "that it's time for the truth to be told. All of it." Inspector Craddock looked startled. "Miss Whitfield, this is official police business." I'm sure," she interrupted, her voice steady, "because I'm the one who placed the watch under the tree. I'm the one who left the ledger page beneath the floorboard. I'm the one who's been trying to make someone." She looked directly at Gregory Hale. "Finally tell the truth about what happened to my father." The silence that followed this announcement was absolute. Even the fire seemed to pause in its crackling. "Your father," Mrs. Lane whispered. "Arthur Whitcomb was my father," Lucy Whitfield said. "My mother was Eleanor Whitfield. She and my father had a brief relationship before his marriage was arranged by his family. When she found herself with child, he provided for us financially, but refused to acknowledge me publicly. I grew up knowing who my father was, but forbidden to claim the relationship." Miss Marple's mind raced through the implications. Lucy Whitfield, not Whitcomb. A daughter kept secret, provided for but never acknowledged. And when Arthur died, she would have inherited nothing, all his estate going instead to his nephew. "When my mother died last year," Lucy continued, her voice tight with emotion, "I found my father's letters to her hidden among her belongings. And I found something else's journal from the months before his death. In it, he wrote about his fear of Gregory, about the threats that had been made, about his intention to change his will, not to leave everything to Gregory, but to finally acknowledge me as his daughter and provide for me properly." She reached into her bag and withdrew a small, leather-bound book. "He wrote that he had made a terrible mistake in denying me all those years, that he wanted to make amends before it was too late. But he never got the chance, did he, Mr. Hale? Because 3 days after he wrote that entry, he was dead." Gregory Hale was weeping, now silent tears running down his face. "You don't understand," he said brokenly. "You don't understand what happened that night." "Then tell us," Inspector Craddock said, his voice gentler now. "Tell us the truth, Mr. Hale. After 10 years, I think it's time." And slowly, haltingly, Gregory Hale began to speak. The words came painfully, as though each one was being dragged up from some deep well of guilt and fear. "I was at the pond that night. Uncle Arthur had summoned me there. Said he wanted to talk where we wouldn't be overheard. He told me he was changing his will, that I would inherit nothing. He'd discovered he had a daughter." Hale glanced at Lucy. "He meant to provide for her instead. I was angry. I'd counted on that inheritance to pay my debts. We argued. He turned to walk away on. I pushed him," Mrs. Lane gasped. But Hale continued, his voice hollow with remembered horror. "He stumbled on the icy bank and fell into the water. I watched him struggle and I did nothing. I just stood there and did nothing while he drowned. Then I took his watch. I don't know why, perhaps as proof to myself of what I'd done, and I went back to the church. The vicar saw me leaving as choir practice ended, and I let him believe I'd been there all along." The room was utterly silent. Outside, snow had begun to fall against soft and relentless, covering the world in white. Chapter 10. Truth beneath the tree. Inspector Craddock moved forward, his hand reaching for the handcuffs at his belt butt. Miss Marple raised one hand in a gentle gesture that somehow commanded attention, despite its lack of force. "A moment, if you please, Inspector. I think there is more to be heard before we conclude this matter." She turned to Lucy Whitfield, whose expression had not changed throughout Gregory Hale's confession. There was no satisfaction, no sense of vindication, a kind of weary determination. "Miss Whitfield," Miss Marple said quietly, "you've gone to considerable trouble to bring us to this moment, the watch, the smoke device, the carefully planted evidence. You've staged a revelation worthy of a theatrical production, but I wonder if you might tell us how you came by your father's watch in the first place." Lucy's composure wavered for the first time. "I found it," she said. "When I came to St. Mary Mead a month ago, I began to investigate. I broke into Mr. Hale's cottage one evening when he was at choir practice. The watch was locked in his desk, drawer along with my father's journal. The original journal, not just the copy I'd made from my mother's papers. You broke in," Inspector Craddock said sharply. "That's a serious offence, Miss Whitfield." "Not as serious as murder," Lucy replied with a sudden heat. "He killed my father and stole my inheritance. For 10 years, he's lived comfortably on money that should never have been his. I wanted justice, Inspector. I wanted him to face what he'd done. But why the elaborate staging?" Craddock asked. It was Miss Marple who answered, her voice thoughtful. "Because, Inspector, Miss Whitfield wanted more than mere justice. She wanted confession. She wanted Mr. Hale to admit what he'd done, to live with the fear and guilt that she believed he deserved to feel. Isn't that right, my dear?" Lucy Whitfield's eyes met Miss Marple's and something passed between them, an understanding perhaps, of the complex mixture of grief and anger that could drive a person to such lengths. "Yes," Lucy said simply. "I wanted him to suffer as I had suffered as my mother suffered, dying without ever seeing my father acknowledge me. I wanted him to know that someone remembered, that someone knew what he'd done." "So you created the smoke device," Miss Marple continued, "working through the sequence of events, and you wrapped the watch in that distinctive green paper. You gained access to the vicarage through the French windows during the time when Mrs. Lane was upstairs and the vicar was out. You lifted the floorboard, placed the ledger page you'd torn from your father's journal, and positioned the wrapped parcel beneath the tree." "Yes," Lucy confirmed. "I knew there would be a decorating party that afternoon. I had heard Mrs. Lane mention it to the library committee. It seemed the perfect opportunity to ensure the watch would be discovered with witnesses present. And the coat?" Inspector Craddock asked. "The one we found in the vicarage cupboard." "That was mine as well," Lucy admitted. "I found it in the attic of my father's cottage, Mr. Hale's cottage, now along with other belongings that had never been disposed of. The coat had been there all these years, stored away where no one would think to look for it. I took it when I took the watch hand, placed it in the vicarage cupboard the night before the decorating party along with the map I'd drawn based on descriptions. In my father's journal." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "But there's something that troubles me, Miss Whitfield. You said you found your father's journal among Mr. Hale's possessions yet. You also said you'd made a copy from papers among your mother's belongings. Which is the truth?" For the first time, Lucy Whitfield looked genuinely uncomfortable. She glanced at Gregory Hale, who had stopped weeping and was now watching her with an expression that might have been pity. "I lied," she said at last. "My mother had no papers, no letters. My father provided money through a solicitor, but never wrote to her directly. When she died, I had nothing but her word that Arthur Whitcomb was my father and, even that she'd only told me on her deathbed. I came to St. Mary Mead hoping to find some proof, some acknowledgement of my existence. And did you find it? Miss Marple asked gently. No, Lucy said, her voice breaking for the first time. I found nothing, no letters, no journal, no mention of me anywhere in his effects. It was as though I'd never existed for him at all. So I invented the evidence. I created the journal entries, aged the paper, made it look authentic. I needed something to justify what I was doing, some proof that he had cared, that he'd meant to acknowledge me. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Inspector Craddock looked thunderstruck and even the vicar seemed at a loss for words. But the watch was real, Craddock said. You did find that in Hale's desk. Gregory Hale finally spoke, his voice raw with emotion. She found it because I kept it there, as a reminder, as a punishment for myself. Every day for 10 years, I've looked at that watch and remembered what I did, or, rather, what I failed to do. He stood slowly, as though his legs barely supported him. Miss Whitfield, Lucy, your father did mean to acknowledge you. That much was true. He told me so that night at the pond. He said he'd made a terrible mistake in denying his daughter all those years that he was going to change his will and leave everything to you. That's why I pushed him, not because I would inherit nothing, but because I felt betrayed. I'd been his ward, his responsibility, and he was going to throw me aside for a child he'd never even met. So you killed him. Lucy said flatly, no. Hale's voice was firm now, stronger than it had been. That's what I've let myself believe all these years, but it's not the truth. The whole truth. He turned to face Inspector Craddock directly. When I pushed my uncle, he fell into the water, but he wasn't unconscious. He could have climbed out. The bank was slippery, yes, but not impossible. I stood there watching him struggle, and I thought about letting him drown. I thought about it for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. And then I reached down to help him. You helped him, Mrs. Lane said in astonishment. I tried to, but as I reached for his hand, I slipped on the ice myself. I fell hard, struck my head on a rock, and when I came to, I was lying on the bank, and my uncle was gone. The water was still empty. I searched as best I could, called out for him, but there was nothing. I thought I'd killed him by my hesitation, by those few seconds when I'd stood there contemplating murder. So I took his watch. It had come loose and was lying on the bank, and I ran. Miss Marple studied his face carefully. The man was either telling the truth, though was a far better actor than she'd given him credit for. Why didn't you report the accident? Inspector Craddock demanded. Because I'd pushed him. Because I'd hesitated to help him, because even if I hadn't actually killed him, I'd wanted to. And everyone would know it. The debts, the threats of disinheritance, I had every motive. Who would have believed it was an accident? So you let everyone think he drowned while walking alone, Miss Marple said. You returned to the church, made sure the vicar saw you leaving with the others, and kept silent for 10 years. Yes, Hale whispered. And it has haunted me every day since. Inspector Craddock was writing rapidly in his notebook. This is still a serious matter, Mr. Hale. At the very least, you failed to report an accident and deliberately misled the investigation. At worst, your actions contributed directly to Arthur Whitcomb's death. I know, Hale said simply. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences follow. Lucy Whitfield had sunk into a chair. Her fierce determination collapsed into something that looked very much like despair. He meant to acknowledge me, she said softly. My father really meant to acknowledge me. Miss Marple moved to sit beside her, her voice gentle but clear. Your father made mistakes, my dear, serious mistakes, in how he treated both you and your mother. But it seems he was trying, at the end, to do the right thing. That must count for something. And I've made everything worse, Lucy said bitterly. I forged evidence, broke into home-staged an elaborate deception, all for nothing. Not for nothing, Miss Marple corrected gently. You've brought the truth to light, Evan, if it wasn't quite the truth you expected. And sometimes that's all we can do, shine a light into dark corners and see what emerges. Inspector Craddock closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Miss Whitfield, I'll need you to come to the station to make a formal statement about your actions, the breaking and entering, the forged documents. These are serious matters that must be addressed. Mr. Halliew as well. As the inspector made his arrangements, Miss Marple moved quietly to the Christmas tree. The floor beneath it still showed the mark where the board had been lifted, still bore that telltale ink stain. She bent down carefully and touched the spot where the mysterious parcel had lain. Mrs. Lane, she said, I wonder if I might help you replace this floorboard properly. It seems only right to put things back as they should be. Together, the two women knelt and fitted the board back into place, pressing it down until it sat flush with the others. The ink stain remained visible, a permanent reminder of all that had transpired. But the board itself was secure once more. There, Miss Marple said, straightening with some difficulty. Some presents, Mrs. Lane, are meant to open old wounds so they may finally heal. This Christmas has brought painful revelations, but perhaps also the possibility of peace. Truth, when it finally emerges, can be a gift when it's not the gift we thought we wanted. Outside, the snow continued to fall soft and relentless, covering the village in its clean white blanket. Inside the vicarage, the Christmas tree stood witness to the conclusion of a mystery that had waited 10 years to be solved. The ornaments caught the fading afternoon light and threw it back in gentle gleams, as though blessing all who stood beneath its branches. Gregory Hale would face justice for his actions, though perhaps not the harsh judgment he had feared. Lucy Whitfield would face consequences for her deceptions, but she would also carry with her the knowledge that her father had, in the end, meant to do right by her, and the village of St. Mary Mead would remember that even the darkest secrets must eventually come to light than that Christmas. For all its celebration of joy and peace, it was also a season for truth. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to take her leave. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back at the triat, the spot where a mysterious parcel had lain just days before. Some gifts, she reflected, carried lessons rather than treasures. And sometimes those lessons, painful though they might be, were exactly what we needed to receive.